I think most of you know this, but just in case you don't, Dutch Island is actually part of Jamestown. So Jamestown Historical Society has been very interested in keeping up on what's going on over there. So we're very interested in being here tonight ourselves, both to learn as well as to tell you something about the history of Dutch Island. Next. Down. Okay, there we go. Basically, before 1657, Dutch Island belonged to the Narragansett, as did almost all of the islands in Narragansett Bay. As early as 1616, as far as we can tell, the Dutch had some kind of a trading post on Dutch Island. That's how it got its English name, if you will. It had an Indian name, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but 1658. The 101 men from Newport, Portsmouth, and Saunderstown, or north of Kingstown, bought both Connecticut and Dutch Island from the Indians. They had a pre-purchase agreement that was signed by all 101 of them. They divided up the land and it signed who was going to get what. The decision to purchase the islands was because they'd been trying to talk the colony into buying it, because they'd been leasing it, if you will. They had the right to put sheep on Connecticut, they had the right to reap the grasses on Connecticut, but they were a little worried about the Dutch again, because they were still trading in Narragansett Bay. And in fact, this was a major problem in this area, in this time, not just in terms of Connecticut, but also in terms of all of Narragansett Bay. So they purchased it, they divided up Connecticut, but on Dutch Island, they didn't divide it into lots. They said that the island belongs to everybody in common, and each person gets to use the island to the percentage that they own land on Connecticut Island. And you can see how that worked is in John Whedon giving his son John Whedon in 1710 said, "I bequeath my house and my land at the north end. I bequeath my lot in town, and I bequeath the rights to my land in Dutch Island." And land was sold that way, as a right to be able to use the land, not as a lot on the land. After the Revolution and into the 19th century, things changed. It's a little difficult to figure out exactly how it happened, but the reasons for it are easy enough to understand. The Connecticut Island population, which essentially owned Dutch Island at that point, was down to under 400 people. All of the cattle and sheep, which had been grazing on both of the islands, had been removed to the mainland by the order of the General Assembly in 1776. So there was nothing very much going on even on Connecticut, and there wasn't very much money on Connecticut either. So they kind of left Dutch Island to take care of itself. In 1825-26, the state gave the southern part of the island to the federal government for a lighthouse. That's all I'm going to say about that. If anybody is more interested in it, we have a whole book that talks about the people who were the keepers of the Dutch Island Light, and also gives a history of the light and what it was used for, and when certain things happened there, like when they got their bell as a foghorn. Somebody brought that up today, so I wanted to mention that, and things of that nature. So that's all in there, and I figured that wasn't part of what you were interested in today. The other thing that happened was in early 1860s, a man by the name of John Carpenter bought the whole island and tried to set up a fish oil processing plant. He wasn't very successful, and he sold the land, the island, to the federal government. He actually sold it in 1863, but before that, the federal government had already established a training camp on the island for the, I'm going to have to read this, 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery Colored. It was the regiment that had enlisted 1,500 black soldiers across New England and were training them, and so that is where the training camp was. The first thing they did was build a couple of batteries out on the island, the lower battery, which is way down near the lighthouse, and a earthworks battery in the center of the island. The interesting thing about group itself was that 15 of the people there died of smallpox during that first winter. And they were buried on the island. And if you can see the picture, I don't know whether you can in this light, that's a picture of the actual burial ground, and in the middle is an obelisk that was put up in 1823 in honor of these men that had died out there. It was on the northeastern shore, in front of the barracks up there. It is considered Rhode Island Cemetery, Jamestown 13. Which means that it's still considered to be a historic cemetery, even though all of the bodies have been moved to the Veterans Cemetery in Long Island. After the Civil War, basically the whole island just stayed with the federal government, and development was on hold. The most important thing that happened was the development of a wharf on the east side of the island. It's interesting, the census of 1875 shows only 13 inhabitants on the island, 1 soldier, 1 lighthouse keeper, 1 engineer and their respective families, and some servants. And that was the only people living on Dutch Island. Things began to change in when the Endicott period of building fortifications began. William Endicott had been Grover Cleveland's Secretary of War, and he had reported that we had no defenses on our shoreline and we had to do something about it. It took over a decade for something to be done about it, but in 1898, you began to get forts built along the shoreline, and 3 of them were on Jamestown. One of them was over at Fort Kearny over on this side. So you had a lot of forts being built at that period. The first one actually was Fort Rebel. It was named after the first West Point graduate to be killed in the Civil War. And every time I say that, I think to myself, maybe I should add fighting for the North. So, he was killed early in the war, and so this was named after him. In 1898, they began to build the batteries out here. I've put up on here the dates that those batteries were built, but basically it was between 1897 and 1901, although one of them was severely changed after that. There was lots of changes during the First World War also. Early in the 20th century, this was a largely self-sufficient military community. It had a post office, it had its own hospital, it had bowling alleys, it had a bakery, it had its own currency. We actually have in the Jamestown Historical Society collection some coins that say bakery on them, 1 bread, and things of that nature. So we have been trying, by the way, to collect coins like that if anybody has any. We're always willing to accept donations. There were barracks for the enlisted men, and that's what this picture down here is. You can actually see them if you look out the window. The red brick building on the top end of Dutch Island was a barracks for the enlisted men. There were also lots of other buildings on the island. Next slide, please. These are some postcards that were sent out from Fort Rebel during the teens and the early 20s. That's the approach to the island coming from Jamestown. You can see all of the buildings out there, some of the barracks at the north end. This was the hospital down here. This is basically the officers' row, which was on the hill in the middle. So you had the barracks, you had the officers' row, you had a hospital, you had a complete community of about 500 men. There were problems, of course, with having a fort on an island where you had no water. There were no natural springs on Dutch Island. They had to pump the water in from Saunderstown, which they did under the bay for a while. The pipe froze a couple of times. The bay, in fact, froze a couple of times, so that they had to actually bring goods in, or material like food in across the ice. You could drive the car across the ice in the 20s, occasionally. There was also water brought in by boat. Many of the West Ferry ferries, the West Passage ferries, had special tanks for carrying water, specifically to get it to the men on Fort Rebel. But most importantly, in terms of the fort becoming obsolete, was that the weaponry that had been put in during that early period was made totally obsolete by aircraft. It had no ability to shoot at an upper angle. It had no ability to be camouflaged. As you can actually see in this picture, this is from, I believe is from the 1940s, but you can see where no, it's later than that. Anyway, you can see the cisterns over on the side, the round pieces, and then you can see that would be Mitchell, I think, in the middle. This is uncamouflageable from an air point of view. So it was, the fort was very little used during the Second World War. It was used occasionally for training. It was finally discontinued in 1947. This is a picture of the Rhode Island National Guard training camp out on Gretel, but it's actually from the 1920s, but I don't have one from anything later. So it was turned over to the state in
the Lighthouse Association. I mean, you all do such tremendous work, and Keith from Abport does just great craftsmanship. So, I mean, we're very fortunate to have your passion and involvement and willingness to assist in maintaining and honoring the preservation of these kind of iconic historic elements of our history here. So that's what I want to say that first. So, as was said, the Army Corps was expected to be here, give you a little presentation on their mitigation project. They gave us a little PowerPoint. I'm just going to go through it for Dave. The department has known for quite a while, obviously, from the acquisition of the islands and other landside former military installations about the hazards of abandoned military installations. Goes all the way from our South County properties in Charlestown, all the way through Fisherman's, to Fort Adams, to Brent Point. I mean, literally, it is dotted with fortifications coastwise. Walter Schroeder was very helpful in helping to establish where the priorities of investment would be, allowing some restoration efforts to be focused on what could be the best example, and the others have been literally some buried, some otherwise vegetated with nasty poison ivy and hopefully other dissuading factors. But nonetheless, as you all know, people still access these areas. But the point of the story is Fort Adams is that focus of attention. We have the Fort Adams Trust that was created by statute that is a quasi able to operate a little differently outside of the protocols for a government agency. Nonetheless, it's those partnerships like with you, partnerships with Beavertail, partnerships with Fort Adams, that keep these military significant historical elements in some degree of public interest and access. On the access side, the department was formally noticed back in the late 80s by an attorney who brought forward the challenge that these abandoned military installations, they basically created a gross negligence threshold if the department were not to remedy those situations and still invite the public out to these public properties. We acquired, the deeds show, 1958, 1962 for Dutch Island, yet we know that these military installations were fully developed and all the way up into the World War II era in the 40s. But when the military, again, transferred these properties, these remnants created this potential public safety issue. So the department had no choice but to ultimately declare a no trespassing policy, which is why we say, if you ask me, I say no. If you don't ask me, I know you're out there. We're not going to send the police. But between the cisterns, which have been an infamous element out there, and some of the other fall hazards, the notion that someone would not take personal responsibility for themselves and look to sue the state, obviously that threshold is a statute called the Landowner Liability Statute that basically provides indemnification to both private property owners and government entities who make properties available to the general public for no fee for the purposes of recreation. and it gives us some protection. You may be familiar with the infamous Cliff Walk case and whatnot, but that statute has been our lifeline to allowing the public the maximum opportunity as possible for the types of recreation we couldn't have even envisioned years ago. I have bouldering and kite surfing, and I mean, you can just imagine the extreme biking that goes on and whatnot. But the point to this is that, yes, we're aware that folks go out onto Dutch Island. And yes, we know once upon a time we offered an invitation to the public. We managed 5 first come, first served, no fee for a reason, campsites. We also understood the elements that were out there. We allowed public hunting out there. And when we received this attorney's letter, the department unfortunately had to take that position, no trespassing, and then look to the federal government, the Army Corps in particular, who was the only one with the kind of talent to address some of these issues, but to engage the Army Corps into a remediation project, not just for fall hazards, but also for environmental hazards. They left a lot of abandoned underground oil storage tanks. And I have to tell you, I'm extremely impressed as I've dealt with them over the years at mitigation projects elsewhere, that they can get into the underbrush and say, right there is a 1,000-gallon oil tank. And sure enough, right there is a 1,000-gallon oil tank that I can't imagine anybody else except the guy who put it in would know it was there after all these years. So they are a very detailed organization, very skilled organization. The one thing they lack to implement these things in a timely manner, which is why we've been waiting so long, is funding. And so as you can imagine in the federal government budget funding strategy, they're not necessarily the priority for funding, but lo and behold, for all of what you're concerned with tonight, Dutch Island got funded. We worked with Army Corps. They identified all of those buildings, all of those full mitigations, 6 feet or more. They identified all of the oil tanks, and they developed a strategy to get equipment out onto the island. The department did give them an access agreement that allowed them to legally mobilize. They've been working out there probably a year and a half now, I'd say. Because of the understory and the overgrowth and the vegetation that obviously has not had any maintenance or management over the years, that they did quite a bit of clearing to create a loop roadway to get access to all of the structures and points of remediation that they needed to have. It's important to understand that while that history of public access and use has been kind of unmanaged, uncontrolled to some extent, the island is basically acquired by deed for the conservation of wildlife. So we are restricted to that prioritization. That doesn't mean the public can't have access, doesn't mean we can't develop trails, doesn't mean, but we have to have the prioritization and for the management of wildlife, both avian wildlife, flora, fauna. So the reality is there's also a natural resource assessment going out there by our fish and wildlife biologists to ultimately try and get a better timeline understanding of what the valued, potentially endangered resources are out there. We have found in other coastal areas endangered species that need to be concerned. We don't necessarily put signs up that say, beware of endangered species, but trust me, they're out there. So we need to take a well-thought, managed approach to what kind of development will go out there. So before I get ahead of myself, let me go through Dave's presentation. I think it basically outlines what their project is and what they've been doing. So this is batteries, battery Ogden, 2 3-inch rapid fire guns have been superimposed. In the upper battery, there have been 10-inch disappearing guns. It's got quite that history, but I'm only identifying these because these are points of remediation of these structures. So, as it says, it was established as a sizable post in the late 19th century in conjunction with Fort Philip Kearny. It commanded the West Passage, and it shows some outlines, as we've seen, of some of the batteries. The remedial project was implemented under the defense Defense Environmental Restoration Program for formerly used defense sites. Projects constructed under the dirt funds program are federally funded. Property owner provided a right of entry, as I said. The project category for approved projects, the course can mitigate falling hazards of 6 feet or more. The project category for approved projects, the Corps can remediate containerized hazardous waste such as underground and above ground fuel tanks that have received no post-DOD beneficial use. It gives you a virtual map of their access and their visitation to the fort, and you can pretty much see that loop road that they constructed out there to get access to all of these. I won't go through each of the elements it identifies, but if anybody doesn't have a package and is interested in getting a copy of this, I'll be happy to make that available to you somehow, through email or whatever, if I can just get your name. So the project's principal goal is to develop a plan to mitigate qualifying falling hazards so that visitors using ordinary and reasonable care can safely visit Dutch Island. A plan for installation of hot dip galvanized steel barricade railing, meeting OSHA requirements and enclosure of various holes and openings was adopted. A selected rail arrangement reflects the area's anticipated use and satisfies public safety and FUD's program considerations. Gives you a diagram of the railing, and if any of you are familiar with Fort Weatherall in Jamestown, let's see, also Fisherman's, you'll see a similar type railing. It's only a 4-foot railing, but what it does is it gives you that sign that you're not invited past that railing. But should you choose to go over that railing, you're on your own. We know people do it, and it's been a successful mechanism for us, because whether it's 6 feet, 4 feet, if they want to get on the other side, they're going to get on the other side. I would share with you some anecdotal evidence of their intent for so much that we've done over the years in trying to block some of these fall hazards. They've taken torches, oxygen acetylene torches. They've taken 4-wheel drives with 100-foot of chain to drag cinder block. It's just astounding what they do. So it shows, it depicts a number of the primary concerns, the cistern, it shows some of the plugs. Part of the history has been these failed attempts at providing some of this public safety security measures. There was a huge effort back in 2000 by the department to do that. Unfortunately, theft and vandalism, once again, just kept opening these public safety concerns. And so once again, in 2000, I believe it was, the department issued a press release, once again declaring no trespass, no public access for those reasons. So it shows you elements of where barricade railings, that 6 foot or more falling hazard, how they're going to be installed. And ultimately in his summary, it just basically says that they can mitigate falling hazards of 6 feet or more, can remediate abandoned fuel tanks. The program participation is voluntary, which for us it would be mandatory, obviously. And so ultimately, I think that just kind of summarizes what their work has been out there. They're expected to be done, I believe, by the end of the month. I went out there with the town manager from Jamestown, the police chief, back in, I believe it was April, with some of my staff, to basically see what the progress has been out there. The amount of work that they've done out there just in clearing vegetation to get access to a lot of these remnants is impressive. It was no small feat to basically provide even some of these shots that you get. These were ultimately buried in vegetation out there. So there's progress. We believe that this will satisfy the legal requirement for us to consider that all gross public safety elements have been addressed. They are the premier agency, folks who would ultimately perform that kind of work and determine that, but I'm sure the department, once we do the final walkthrough, will pretty much accept that as being that threshold. That means then we're into the next phase, which I can talk more about on the DPM hat side, is obviously, as I stated, the priority for the conservation of wildlife is the mandate for us. there is a reverter clause to the U.S. government that shall we fail and not provide that strategy or that management objective, that it could, I think it's highly unlikely, but it could revert back to the federal government for whatever reason. So, having said that, we realize that there will be a public invitation out there. We desire to have a boat access dock. We look to the existing dock. I brought an overview aerial, if any of you didn't see it, it's on the wall. You can take a look at it after. It's basically a satellite aerial. It's probably a couple of years old because it does not show any of the activity Army Corps has done out there. But literally, it does show a remnant dock on the east side that we see as that access point for development. We would look to some small boat access to that dock so that folks can get on the island. From that point, obviously, we look at a trail system. And we don't think it's going to be all that complex a system, but we want to take advantage of the clearing that the Army Corps already did. So we are just thinking that that will lay itself out for a route that will get people not only around the island, but give them access, and hopefully we would have interpretive panels that would educate the visiting public out there as to what all that history, what all those historic elements were, so that that public education and the value of that history can be given. At the same point, we would look to reestablishing those 5 or so, once we identify the locations, first come, first served, but permitted campsites. We still want to keep the no-fee public access for the protections of the landowner liability statute. But we get a lot of requests these days, particularly from kayakers, blue water trails, folks that want to make a weekend and say, you know, I'm paddling around the bay and I need to make a stop overnight. Can I in fact go out there? And once again, unfortunately, because you asked me, I have to tell you no. But I also have to tell you, if you're out there and you get reported, it's not high on my priority list to send my private police officer. But at the same point, you also say, but you gotta behave out there, you know that, don't you, right? So unfortunately, there are those, when you're in serving public with invitations to have a good time, sometimes folks have too much of a good time, and they don't necessarily respect other folks or the natural environment. We are a carry in, carry out state. We already realize that. Our parks, our beaches, pretty much we ask for a very simple conservation ethic, similar to the no trace camping thing, which is, if you bring it in, please take it home. And so, whether it's litter, whether it's, not so much dumping, because you gotta get out there from here, but nonetheless, remnants of public access. We want to be able to strengthen that message. We do need to identify some sort of, whether it's seasonal or not, some presence that gives us the ability to go out there and monitor situations, oversee some of the activities that may be going on out there. So the department is looking potentially at that. Of course, there's the white-nosed bats that we have an issue with at this point. There are some other species of concern we have an issue with. There have been requests for deer hunting. There is a deer population out there. We do find some winter kill out there. Don't know why. Plenty of food. And obviously swim to Fort Getty. It's not that far. But nonetheless, so we're in that investigation stage, that natural resource and kind of inventory stage, qualifying what the habitats are. More importantly, it is part of Jamestown. And as I said to you, we've taken the town manager, the police chief out there. They have some ideas. I'm sure the community has some ideas. We want to get our ideas in the department settled down first before we engage the local community. Ultimately, I know you all have interest in that. I'm sure there will be at some point a public opportunity for you to participate in what ultimately will be the final vision of the plan. But at the same point, I mean, we hope to make it accessible to as many folks as we can, with a safe experience, with a valuable experience. We're very fortunate, as you go through the ownership history, that it belongs to all of us right now, and it's there. You get the pleasure, for the most part, I'm a Plum Beach guy, I'm just down the road. We all enjoy this, and this is, you know, part of what makes the state so great, is ultimately the quality of the landscape and the opportunities that we all have. Just get in a boat and go to an island that has a natural rookery on it. I mean, it's just, there are values there, and so I know there will be some who say, why is the department being so rigid in some of the management options?
Some Dutch Island Lighthouse t-shirts and hats. We're still trying to raise money to fund the lighthouse, to keep it going, to keep entertaining, and I'll explain that in a minute. There is also a sign-up sheet over here. We will be sending out notices to people about different events, such as this one, any kind of information that comes up. So if you'd like to be on that list, it'd be great if you just put your name down there. And we are doing primarily electronic contact these days. We'll do mailing if you want it, but if you put down an email address, we'll just contact you and let you know what's going on. For the light, it was a fixed white light. And in 1878, a fog bell was installed, which you can see hanging off the edge of the lighthouse there. That fog bell was there until somewhere in the 60s. I remember it hanging off the end of that lighthouse. Somebody has that bell. I know it's sitting in somebody's garage. If anybody knows where that bell is, we would love to get it back and put it back on the lighthouse. The tower was also, the bell itself was activated by sort of a clock mechanism. It was like a grandfather's clock, you wind it up. The clock mechanism is actually still in the lighthouse. We have it. It's not in very good shape, but it's obviously that's what it was. In 1924, it was converted to a flashing red light. And then in 1943, if you can switch the... So this here, this is prior to us actually working on it, but this is what the lighthouse looked like prior to us doing anything. I'm just looking at the end of the island. In 1943, the light was automated, lit by electricity, and it was a flashing red beacon. And in 1947, the military left the island, and in 1979, or 1950, the keeper's house was demolished, and then in 1979, the Coast Guard abandoned the island. And that's pretty much what you see here, okay? Once they left, they demolished the building, they turned the light off, it was no longer activated, and they replaced the light with a bell buoy off the end of the island. You can switch the thing. So here's a picture of the lighthouse prior to the Dutch Island Lighthouse Society doing anything. This is the condition that it was in. You can see this is what we refer to as the oil house. It had no roof. The lighthouse itself, there was no glass up here. It was open to the environment. There were birds living in it. It wasn't as bad as Plum Beach, but it was not a happy sight at the side of there. In around 2000, the Dutch Island Lighthouse Society was formed by a group of people who were, some of them were in this room, and they decided to try to do something to restore the lighthouse, and through their efforts, they formed the Dutch Island Lighthouse Society, and they started raising money and got government money to help. And they finally got to a point, and you go to the next slide. Okay, you can see here, that's the oil house, that's the lantern room that's totally open to the elements. Next slide. This is looking from Jamestown. Go to the next one. Okay, so in 2007, after the DILS had been formed, they'd done lots of fundraisers. They contributions from all of you people, and also from the government. We got enough money to where we could actually do the restoration of the lighthouse. We hired Abcor Restoration with his Keith Lescarbeau owns. He was going to be here tonight, but he couldn't make it. But Keith is a fanatic when it comes to restoring these lighthouses. He really has a passion with it. And he did a fabulous, fabulous job. And he started working at the end of the summer in 2007. And you can see all the scaffolding. He stripped the entire lighthouse. There was a lot of moss and growth on it. And he essentially stripped the entire lighthouse down. Go to the next slide. Here he is. This is Keith here. He always smiles like that. He's always happy when he's working. These are some of his workers. They were up on top of the lighthouse, on top of the lantern room, grinding off a lot of the corrosion. Okay, so here it is, after they had recoated the lighthouse, and it's not, just so everybody knows, the lighthouse is actually not painted. Okay, it's coated with a parging. It's a limestone mixture, and Keith took samples of the original parging and found there's some mine. Craig may know. I think it's down in the Carolinas someplace.
No, I don't know. No. But it was the architects, Newport Collaborative.
That did
The
that.
one architect was an expert on masonry, and she analyzed it and came up with a formula for mixing the same.
Yeah, so they analyzed the parging and came up with a formula that matched it, so it's the exact same material. And Keith has the formula. So what he does is he goes out and he initially stripped it, and it's kind of like just troweling on cement, but it's kind of a finer material. And he trowels it on, and the advantage to it is it actually breathes. And so he puts a coat on, and what happens is moisture can get into it. Wintertime it freezes, it expands, and it can crack it and break it open to the elements. So it is a constant maintenance thing. It's not something where we can go out and just paint the lighthouse and then forget it. So we did it initially where we painted the lighthouse, or not painted, but we had it resurfaced. And I think it was 3 years later that we had to go out and have it not redone, but he sets up the scaffolding and does patches to it. We have had some issues with the lighthouse and the oil house. The north-facing surfaces get a lot of damage. It's basically in the wintertime because they get wet, they freeze, and because they're facing north, the sun never really hits that surface to dry them out enough, and it causes a lot of damage. In '07, when Keith finished, we got a light set up that we put up into the lighthouse. It's a solar panel light. It's an LED light. There's actually like 144 LED lights in there. A little computer that controls it so that it flashes correctly. 2 solar panels, a couple of very large batteries. It'll run for a week with no sunlight. I had this whole setup in my backyard running for about a month. I was driving my neighbors crazy because the light was going on. I had to check it to make sure that it worked. But we got the light reactivated, and we had a relighting ceremony, which was on November 21st. And we fired off the Webster cannon to signal that the light should go on, and magically we turned it on, and it's been on ever since. And yay! I think this is another one. Okay. Now, we go a couple of years after we've done all this restoration, and you can see the damage that happened to the oil house. This is just from weather. Okay. Same thing with the top of the lighthouse here. That's one of the solar panels. So it's an ongoing maintenance issue that we have. And this year we have a little complicating factor, if anybody's noticed, but there's a rather large bird's nest on the top of the lighthouse right now. And that's actually an osprey nest. And we've been in touch with, or I've been in touch with the Rhode Island Audubon Society. They're well aware of it. They know the situation. And what has happened is there's a spire on the top of the lighthouse. And I think if you go to the next slide. Next one. Oh, go back. Actually, go back. I'm ahead of myself. This was a couple of years after we restored the lighthouse. We went out and had Keith resurface the lighthouse again and work on the oil house. So this is the second time it's been worked on. And at that same time, we upgraded the lantern room. That was a decision that the DILS board had made, that we wanted to clean up the lantern room. It was kind of a mess. We did have a light in there, but it was all rusty and there was leaks in the roof and stuff. So Keith went ahead and we made some plans and we redid the lantern room, and you can see how beautiful it is. He made a whole brass bracket to hold the light up itself. That's the light there. He redid the entire roof inside, sealed it off so that critters can't get in there. So it's actually very pleasant now to go over there and go up into the lantern room, and it's a very clean area, it's really nice. So going to the next one, these pictures I took just about a week ago, okay? And what we have is a very large osprey nest on top of the lighthouse, and you look at it and you go, well, that's kind of cute. Well, it's cute to a point. The problem is there's a lot of bird droppings that actually damage the top of the lighthouse. They damage the paint. The solar panels that are running the lights are on this surface over here, and there are droppings on that, so the solar panels are decreasing in their efficiency. We need to be able to keep those clean. So we've been in touch with the Audubon Society, and what we're going to be doing this fall is moving this nest, okay? And there's a certain way that has to be done, and they're going to work with us with doing that. And we need to get the nest off the top of the lighthouse so that there's no more damage to it. Keith is going to go out there. He has to set up the scaffolding again, do the repairs that he needs to do to the top of the lighthouse. We have to do some modifications to the very top to prevent the birds from being able to land. Okay, so they don't reestablish the nest. And we're going to set up a pole and an osprey nest on the end of the island. We haven't quite figured out exactly where, but relatively close to where the lighthouse is. So we're just going to relocate them. They're still going to be there, but we just don't want them on top of the lighthouse. So that's what we're going to be doing. We do need help in doing this. So there's just a few of us on the board. This is not a big organization. If anybody here is at all interested in helping to maintain this, because this is an ongoing thing, we welcome anybody who would like to join our board. And we're also going to be hopefully working with Larry with now that the island's going to be opened up. There's a lot of opportunities out here, okay, to get people to be able to come out to the island, be able to come out and see the lighthouse. You know, we would love to be able to set it up so we could possibly have people, see the inside of the lighthouse. Now, we haven't restored the first 3 floors of it. That's another project that we would like to do. There's lots of things that we would like to do. But it is a safe structure. It's now secured. We haven't had any vandalism, which has been really great. That was a problem that had been occurring for many, many years prior to us restoring it. But we would love to have people help us. So again, over here, we do have a sign-up sheet. And if you put down your name and your address and your email contact, we'll be able to keep you posted on what's going on. And we'd love your help. So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our panel up here. And if anybody has any questions, the board's open. The floor is open.